All right. All right, let's get started. International trade, really one of my favorite chapters, maybe only second to elasticities, but I think it's really interesting. I think it's something that we hear about a little bit, but don't truly understand how international trade works and how incredibly important it is, especially in the fields of economics. And so we're just going to start really by talking about why we trade, which we did touch upon in one of the first chapters of the semester, and then talking through some specifics about the US, who our trade partners are and things like that. And then kind of walking through an example of what life would look like if we didn't trade, and then how it changes because we do trade, or how it changed when we did decide to participate or were able to participate in international trade. 100% of the countries in the world participate in international trade. 100% of the countries. So it definitely has an impact on all of our lives, some more than others. Here in the US, we do export a lot of goods and we import even more. We are hugely impacted by international trade. No matter what field you go into, right, there's going to be some international component there. So we can't talk about international trade without talking about trade in general, specialization in trade, and comparative advantage. So this is just a reminder of the law of comparative advantage that you heard several chapters ago. I want to say it's chapters 2 or 3 is where we covered comparative advantage. So the law of comparative advantage, if you remember, says that the individual, in this case, the individual is going to be an individual country, because we're talking about international trade. But individual is defined as a person, a company, a region, or a country. So individual has a broad definition. So the individual with the lowest opportunity cost of producing a particular good should specialize in that good. So lowest opportunity costs. Each country, because we're talking about international trade, each country should specialize in making the goods in which they have the lowest opportunity cost or comparative advantage. That happens for the most part. For the most part, the countries make what they make for a reason. And that reason is because they have comparative advantage. Now, when we get to the material on Monday where we're talking about trade restrictions, we'll see that this isn't always true, but it's mostly true, okay? We'll talk about the exceptions when we get to Monday. So here's just, and again, this is a little antiquated because it's just what the latest version of your book has in it. But these proportions, these numbers aren't that important specifically. What's important is to kind of look at what's happening overall, because that hasn't changed. Now, here's the interesting thing. 2020 has been some sort of year, and the import-export equation for the United States has changed a little bit. So let's talk about, let me first give you the lecture that I would have given you in 2019, and then I'm going to add the 2020 sort of asterisks after it. So this data, like I said, 2014 data, but these percentages generally would have held true through 2019 and even to some extent 2020, okay? So US exports, these are goods that we are sending out of the country, that we are shipping to other countries. In 2014, that was $2.3 trillion, or approximately 30% of our total GDP. GDP, gross domestic product. That's all the goods that are being produced inside of our borders would be considered our GDP. So it is the fair market value of the goods produced within our borders during a given year is usually the number we see as our annual GDP. So approximately 13% of those goods are going to be shipped overseas. The biggest category of export in the United States is going to be a category of services. What services do you think the US exports to other countries as our largest category of export? Thoughts? Not a good service. There's a handful. Guesses, my friends? Management. Okay, maybe Alec. I like that answer. Any other thoughts? Okay, military. That is one of the categories. Yep, so military training and services. Good. There's one big one and a couple other small ones. And Alec, I think you were moving in this direction, but the big category is it's a very specific type of management. So our biggest category is actually financial services, which to me kind of falls under that management category. So for banking and financial services. So we do a disproportionate amount of the world's banking. We store a lot of the world's gold reserves for other banks and other governments, do a lot of banking. Another small one is actually education. We have a large number of international students here in the US, and we do consider that a service. And that education is then taken back to the home country of these students. And so we would consider that an export of education, which is a service. Imports, $2.8 trillion in 2014, or 16% of GDP. You can see that we import more than we export. That's held true for a really, really long time. I want to say back to the 1970s. This is what we call, when you import more than you export, we call this a trade deficit, a trade deficit. I think initially that sounds like a bad thing, a trade deficit. And a lot of politicians, I think, would tell you that a trade deficit's a bad thing. And from an economic perspective, that's not a bad thing. Your consumers get to consume more than you produce. In many regards, that's an increase in standard of living, to be able to consume more goods than you produce, to be able to consume a greater variety of goods than you produce. So I can, from an economic perspective, a trade deficit is not a bad thing. Our biggest category of import, now these are your author's categories, right? Your author has come up with these categories. So depending on where else you looked for this information, they might break it down into more detail or something like that. But the way your author's broken it down, industrial supply is our greatest category, our biggest category of import. Industrial supply, yeah, that's a pretty broad category, but this is really mostly going to be petroleum, oil, and petroleum-based products. So when I say petroleum-based products, a lot of the adhesives that we use in industrial manufacturing production are going to be imported. So we get a lot of adhesives, a lot of rubber that we use to then produce tires, other goods and consumer goods. That's also going to be imported as well. So I would say industrial supply would be petroleum and petroleum-based products. Now, before I teach this chapter every semester. I go online and I do a little bit of research to make sure that, you know, I understand what our position is in terms of international trade and things like that. And I always like to look up our trade partners and things along those lines. And so I did that and was shook this morning. I got up early, knew I was going to start teaching this this topic, went to make sure I had the most updated information, and could not believe the information I was finding. When I typically teach this chapter and begin to talk about who our greatest trade partners are, I usually have a pretty good idea of what that list is. Somebody rose to the top of that list that I did not expect, okay? But hang on to that. First, there's some expected information. There are some expected countries when we talk about exports and imports. Who do you think we export more goods to than any other country? Now, this one hasn't really changed, but it's usually a surprise to students whenever we talk about it. Not Mexico, Benjamin. Who do we export more goods to than any other country? Export. No? It's a little unexpected. Yeah, Jennifer, it's Canada. And in my last class period, they never even came up with Canada. It's Canada. Huh. Yeah, well, I guess that makes sense, right? We actually have exported, Canada has actually topped that list for a long, long time. Okay, at least the decade I've been teaching, right? Canada's been at the top of that list. Okay, how about imports? Who do you think we import more goods from than any other country? Import. Yeah, Ethan, it's China. Yeah, it's China. China's always been pretty close to the top of that list, if not on the top of that list. Okay, actually, China's imports are down, as you can probably imagine. Manufacturing production is down in China because of the virus. Okay, they shut down a lot of production facilities. And so they just simply, it's not that we don't want the stuff, right? They just don't have as much stuff to send. Okay. Now, if we could name our #1 trade partner, this is the one that really got me. Okay. #1 trade partner, how we calculate #1 trade partner is we add imports and exports together. Imports and exports together, and that's how we come up with our #1 trade partner. Any guesses on our #1 trade partner? Imports plus exports. That's right, Benjamin. You got it. It's Mexico. This has not, I believe, and now I don't have historical data since the beginning of time, but I don't believe Mexico has ever been our #1 trade partner. I can tell you in recent history, they have not been. This is mind-blowing to me, okay? Mexico is actually #2 for imports and exports, and summed together rises to the top. For the last decade that I have been teaching international trade, China and Canada have done a little bit of flip-flopping between that #1 position and #2 position for our #1 trade partner. Now, China has really been #1 in terms of imports. Canada has stayed #1 really in terms of exports. And they have flip-flopped for #1 trade partner. Mexico's always been in there someplace, right? Summed together, they are our #1 trade partner. I think this is really interesting. It's really interesting for a couple of reasons. I have really watched Mexico do a dynamite job of trying to entice American companies to go there instead of China. to go there instead of India. By setting up sort of industrial cities along the border so the logistics make sense, right? Why wouldn't you rather drive a good across the border than ship it across an ocean? Shipping across an ocean is fairly expensive. And so even if you can't get labor prices as low in Mexico as you can in China, you might be able to make up for that in terms of really inexpensive transportation. And so I have really watched Mexico entice American companies to move down there in terms of giving them land, providing other incentives, the government providing incentives, creating a really streamlined customs process, getting goods in or intermediate goods or raw materials into Mexico and getting those finished goods back out, like creating a very streamlined process in terms of customs, getting through the border, inspection process, stuff like that. And I've actually spent a lot of time in Mexico in these factories, in these towns, because I just, my mind is blown at how Mexico is really trying to push for that position. And they clearly have done a good job at a really opportune time when China just isn't producing that much. And here Mexico is just sitting literally miles across the border, ready to pick up that production. And they've done it. So brilliantly done, Mexico. Any questions, comments about that? We'll see what happens when we get this virus under control. We'll see if China can get back in. But if Mexico does a good enough job, we could be seeing a huge shift in imports, where we import from. Less dependent on China, perhaps more dependent on Mexico, which is interesting, and from my perspective, might be better, because when you share a border with a country, it perhaps creates incentives for both countries to, I don't know, create mutually beneficial agreements, mutually beneficial circumstances, right? I mean, Mexico will always be to the south, right? And so they're right there, making it pretty easy, I think, to get goods where we need to get them quicker. Any thoughts about that? Comments, concerns? All right, interesting stuff. All right, so, you know, anytime I show you a pie chart like this, you don't need to get overly concerned about it. This is just, I kind of wanted to show you what those other categories were in both the export and the import category. You can see we talked about the two big ones. We talked about the services as an export, industrial supplies as an import. I'm not sure how that's going to shift, or if that really has shifted much in 2020. I'll be interested to see how everything pans out for 2020. But I suspect these basic categories of goods and the percentages have stayed pretty consistent. But honestly, I'm not totally sure. But you never need to get caught up in the detail. If I was studying for the exam or making my cheat sheet or writing notes for the exam, I just put the big ones down. Our big category of export, big category of import. Leave it at that. All right. So we're now going to move into an example, a scenario that walks you through what the world would look like without trade, and then introducing trade and seeing how things change. So again, don't get caught up in the detail of this example either. This example is going to be helpful when you do your homework, But don't get caught up in the details. I'm just going to walk you through a scenario, and it's really that conclusion we come to at the end that ends up being the real takeaway. The real takeaway that you probably could guess already. So just bear with me as I sort of talk you through this scenario. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the PPF, right? Back to, again, chapter, I want to say 2. When we talked about the production possibilities frontier. And we're going to talk about what the PPF looks like and what it represents without trade, and then what it represents when we do decide to trade. So the PPF, if you'll remember, was sort of that bowed out curve. Our example back in chapter 2 was like capital goods and consumer goods for an economy, and like what combinations of those two goods we could produce if we used our existing resources perfectly efficient. If we were perfectly efficient with all of our resources, the PPF, every point along the PPF represented perfectly efficient combinations of those two goods on our X and Y axes, okay? Reminding you what the PPF is. If we do not trade with any other countries, our PPF is also our consumption possibilities frontier. Consumption possibilities frontier, that's new, right? So your production possibilities and your consumption possibilities are equal when you do not trade with other countries. How can you consume more than you produce if you're not trading? We consume more than we produce in this country because of trade. But if you're not trading, the most you can consume is what you can produce, okay? The production possibilities frontiers that you are going to see in this example and on your homework, by the way, are going to be a straight line PPF. The one you saw in chapter 2 was bowed out. That is a more realistic PPF, is the bowed out PPF, okay? This production possibility frontier, the one that you're going to see, is pretty simplified. Your author has done that for a reason, because we don't actually want to get you caught up in PPFs again. We just want to use them to talk us through this scenario, talk us through this example, okay? So they're going to be a straight line PPF. Straight line PPF would be a scenario in which you had a constant trade-off, a constant slope. Remember that curve of the PPF existed because of the law of increasing opportunity costs. Again, you don't need to know that at this point, but this straight line PPF is just kind of a more down and dirty PPF that you would just use to walk through an example like this. Sorry, your author was trying to make things easy. Sometimes when he tries to make things easy, he makes things more complicated to explain. So I apologize for that. Different economies, in this case, countries, we're focusing on countries because we're talking about international trade. These will have different slopes of PPF because they have different opportunity costs of production. Okay, don't overthink it. All right, so right here, I'm going to show you a couple of little charts. So the example from your book, your author's example from your book, has two countries in the global economy, right? We're keeping things simple. And the two countries that he chose, obviously, one's going to be the United States, right? And then he picked a second country, a little island country of Isodia. To my knowledge, Isodia doesn't actually exist. I went looking for it one time and couldn't find it. So, but he describes it as being some island. And so what you have here are basically the two goods that these economies can produce, giving their pool of resources. the goods that they could produce and would want, right? And so there are two big ones, food and clothing. So we're sticking to food and clothing. This would be like capital goods and consumer goods, or clothing or cloth and wheat, which was our example back from chapter 2. We're just picking two. You just have to pick two. They can be two goods, two services, or two large categories. Here we're just keeping it simple, food and clothing, okay? You can see the workers, the number of workers in each economy. That's only important when you're trying to calculate comparative advantage, which I'm just going to do for you. I'm not going to make you do it again. If you need to know how to do it, you can go back to chapter 2. You can, it's not that hard to figure out. So what we have here, if you look on the sort of that top chart for the United States, you'll see U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, U6. And then you'll see a quantity of food and clothing underneath. That is that U1 would basically be US 0.1, US 0.2. These are going to be points along the PPF. We've picked 6. How many points are on the PPF? I don't know, thousands or more. So we've just picked 6 points along the PPF, and then the quantity of each good that could be produced using the given existing pool of resources. Again, don't overthink this. We've picked 6 points on a PPF. We've done the same thing for Isodia, okay? Different numbers, different resources, different situation, okay? But we've done 6 for Isodia as well. That's Isodia 1, Isodia 2. These are points along the PPF. So let's graph all those points and draw some PPFs. So that's what we've done. So all of these points that you see, U1, U2, those are just those combinations of clothing and food. We've plotted that point. We've done that for all 6. We've connected them. That's your straight line PPF. We've done the same thing for Isodia. They have different slopes because we have different pools of resource, okay? So a couple things to note is that you can see these dashed black lines going up to U4 and I3 on these 2 PPFs. That is, it's just a random point. Well, it's not random. It's just a point chosen by your author to represent a point that we call autarky. Autarky. It's not a word I've put anywhere in this lecture. I guess I don't know why I didn't. Autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y, autarky. Autarky, we don't talk about it a lot because it doesn't really exist in the world anymore, but it's really this concept of where would you produce in an economy on a PPF if you didn't trade? Well, we all trade, remember? So it's like a point of reference more than it's reality. So your author chose U4 as the point of autarky for the United States, which basically says if the US was entirely self-sufficient and didn't trade, that is the quantity of food and clothing we would produce and therefore consume. Same thing for Isodia. Your author chose I3 as the point of autarky for Isodia, which means that if Isodia did not trade, use its current pool of resources, it would produce and consume the quantities of food and clothing found at point I3. Hopefully that makes sense, okay? Why is this important? Because it provides a point of reference for us going forward in this example, okay? Why, okay, maybe not why. What would be the factors that would lead us to an autarky of U4? Your author just picked it. But if this was real, if the US didn't trade with other countries, why would we pick U4, you think? What would be sort of those determining factors? Thoughts? It's not that complicated. What would drive the US to produce that quantity of food and that quantity of clothing? This isn't a sophisticated answer, folks. Okay, so maybe food is more important than clothing. So you can see here, food, right? The food number would be higher than the clothing number. Great, Powell. It's a good answer, right? Anything else you can think of? It's what we wanted. It's what we demanded. Hopefully, if our government was trying, right, if our government was dictating this production, hopefully they would try and find the points of production for both of these different goods in which the society would benefit most. But likely in our sort of economy, which is mostly capitalist, right, 60-ish% capitalist, you and I would drive that production through our demand, right? It's the stuff that we wanted. And yes, we would probably deem food more important than clothing. Now, it depends on where you live. If you live someplace where it's really cold, you probably demand more clothing, but overall, right, that would work itself out. But our economy, the people of our economy, the demand from the consumers in our economy would likely drive us to that autarky combination, right? You can see in Isodia, those numbers are more similar. They actually, it looks like, want more clothing than food, right? So maybe that is a really, really cold island where they would want more clothing than food, right? I don't really know. Maybe they caught more of their own food, so they didn't require the production of as much food, something like that, right? But it would be demand. Be the demand of the people, I think, would be one of the biggest driving factors. Okay, so we've looked at what things might look like under no trade. Now let's switch and look at what things currently look like with trade and do a comparison to see, right? See what it looks like, which you already know what it looks like because you live it. So consumption possibilities, we know if you don't trade, consumption possibilities are equal to production possibilities. But we know that the reason we currently trade is because everybody gains from specialization in trade. Now, can I say that every single person everywhere in the world gains from international trade? No. I can say that most people, most countries, overall, as a global society, we gain from international trade, right? At least from an economic perspective. Even from an economic perspective, I can't say every single individual gains, right? For the most part, we do. A very large percentage. So because we know we gain from specialization in trade, each country should specialize in producing the good in which they have the lowest opportunity cost or comparative advantage. Now, this second bullet point, terms of trade, actually isn't applicable to real life, but we need to talk about it in terms of your homework because of the way your homework questions are set up. Terms of trade basically is an agreement between two parties that are trading or exchanging on how many of your good is traded for what quantity of my good. Now, we really don't, that's really bartering, and we really don't barter much anymore. We pay for goods with a currency. And so when we're trading with other countries, we're not really bartering with other countries, right? They're paying for goods in currency. We're paying for goods in currency. It's a currency exchange. Now, your homework's not like that. Your homework is going to have two countries who are trading with one another, who are going to have a term of trade. Think for the most part, the term of trade I've seen more often than not on your homework assignments is a 1-for-1 term of trade, which means 1 unit of your good for 1 unit of my good. And then that's actually going to be the example that we're going to work through right now. Again, not incredibly important, just important for your homework, important for this example. So that brings us to this consumption possibilities frontier. We didn't really need to draw consumption possibilities frontier on the example with no trade because production was equal to consumption. So they were both the same line. Well, when you start to trade, your consumption possibilities change. We know, because we have a trade deficit, that we consume more than we produce. So our consumption possibilities are higher in this country than our production possibilities, okay? So consumption possibilities frontier, it's just another line, another curve, right? That determines the possible combination of goods that we can consume as a result of specialization in trade. So this is now totally different possibilities for consumption. So let's look at that real quick. So you know this red line, you know, that's the PPF that I showed you before. That hasn't changed at all. And your point of autarky is still down there. That's going to be your U4 and your I3, your points of autarky. But this blue line is new. The blue line is your consumption possibilities frontier, assuming you're going to trade. Now, in this case, we're talking about only 2 countries trading with one another. There's only 2 countries in this global economy. Now, we could have walked through the comparative advantage calculation on that previous slide with those 2 little charts with the U1, U2, U3. Like we could have done a comparative advantage calculation, but I was going to spare you that. And for time's sake, we really didn't have time to go through it again. But so I'm just going to tell you that the US has comparative advantage in the production of food in this example, and Isodia has comparative advantage in the production of clothing. You can see that where the consumption possibilities frontiers sort of originate is at the food, right? At the food axes for the US and the clothing axes for Isodia. Now, if we have a 1-for-1 term of trade, which we actually do in this example, and you'll see that it states that in the first line of the description, it means that as the United States, if we make 600 units of food, for every unit of clothing we want, we give up 1 unit of food in order to get that 1 unit of clothing. And so because of that, from every point on from the origin of that consumption possibilities frontier, right, we actually have a greater consumption possibility than our production possibility. Because the thing that happens when you specialize is you get efficient. And that's the beauty of specialization. Is if the US focuses on food and Isodia focuses on clothing, we can create all the efficiencies in that focused good. We can develop technologies, we can find quicker, more efficient ways to do things, and therefore we can probably produce more at a lower cost than if we're trying to produce 2 different goods. And so the US can trade away as many units as they want, right? Up to a point, you can see that consumption possibilities frontier for the US ends at 400 units of clothing. Why? Because Isodia can only produce a total of 400 units of clothing. We actually can't get more than 400 units. Because if we're just producing food, Isodia is the only one making clothing. And so if they can only make 400 units, that's the most we can have. And that's if we took every unit that they produced, okay? Which they probably wouldn't let us have every unit they produce. And you can see, and your author has picked now a second point. How? I have no idea, right? But that new point U along the consumption possibilities frontier would be our new point of consumption with international trade. Now, U4 represented not only the point on our PPF, but also our consumption possibilities that we would pick, that point of autarky. You can see that new point U, we get more of everything when we trade. That was the point of this entire example, was to get you to that place. We're all better off. We all get more of everything at a lower price because of specialization and trade. Okay, you can see over there, if we look at Isodia, Isodia is better off too. They go from point autarky point I3 to point I. They now have totally, they have a totally different level of consumption now through specialization and trade as well. Everybody gains, right? More of everything for everybody at a lower price. That's why we do it. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting bar graph, bar chart, whatever. In that it represents all of these goods that you are seeing along that left-hand side are goods that are produced in the United States to some extent, some quantity, right? And the bar, that horizontal bar, is basically the quantity, but the quantity is expressed in an interesting way. If you look down at the x-axis, you'll see that 100%, those are percents. You'll see that 100% mark. That 100% mark is 100% of the US consumption of that good. So the way it's done is, I think, is pretty interesting, in that any bar that extends beyond 100% represents a good that we produce more of than we use. And any bar that doesn't extend to 100% is a good in which we would have to supplement our usage with imports. So to the right of 100, those are going to be exports. To the left of 100, those are going to be imports. So you can see coffee there. We produce very little of our own coffee because we don't have comparative advantage. Why do we not have the comparative advantage in the production of coffee? A, where do we produce coffee? And then why don't we have comparative advantage to produce all of our own coffee? Thoughts? Where do we produce coffee in the United States? Very little coffee. Hawaii, thank you, Ethan, Hawaii. Because it has the right climate, right? We don't have that climate anywhere else in the United States. Can you imagine trying to grow coffee in Arizona? Like how expensive that would be? You'd probably have to do it inside a climate controlled building. And the amount of energy, effort, and resource it would take to grow coffee does not allow us to have comparative advantage. Now, in Costa Rica, you don't even have to plant coffee. It just grows, right? Doesn't that make sense? Doesn't it make sense that those folks have comparative advantage in the production of coffee? Of course it does, right? And so we import most of our coffee because we don't have comparative advantage. Now you can see down there that a large portion of our exports of these goods, right, are going to be crops. We do have comparative advantage when it comes to crops because we have all of that land in the Midwest that really isn't good for anything else. So what's the opportunity cost of using that land to grow oil seeds, wheat, and cotton? It's a whole lot of nothing, right? The opportunity costs are very low for us to grow crops. I did not realize how much cotton we grew in this country, but you can see they actually had to, your author actually had to kind of reduce that bar on the graph, or else this graph would go out forever. But that cotton production goes out to 500%, which means we produce 5 times the amount of cotton that we actually use. Well, because our opportunity cost is so incredibly low, we should be the ones producing that and shipping it to places that have a higher opportunity cost of growing crops. So it's the beauty of it. It lets everybody utilize their resources right to their fullest extent, and resources in which they have the lowest opportunity cost in the production of these goods. A lot of that copper, sugar, zinc, natural gas, in which we hover close to that 100%, that's actually a lot of what we import from Canada. We actually import a lot of good from Canada. I think Canada, let me bring up my picture real quick. I think Canada might be our second biggest import. Oh no, it's Mexico. I already told you that. So when it comes to imports, China's first, then Mexico, and Canada is actually a pretty close third. The stuff, people are like, imports from Canada. What do we import from Canada? We import things that don't say made in Canada on them. You and I see so many things that say made in China, right? That we know they're one of our big import partners. But we don't know about Canada typically, because if you think about sugar and copper and zinc and natural gas, those aren't stamped made in Canada, right? There are a lot, we import a lot of raw materials from Canada, sort of behind the scenes that we don't even know about, right? Any questions about this graph? I think the way it's set up is kind of interesting. If I was going to ask you, right, what was another large category other than services of U.S. export, I would definitely, agricultural goods is on that list, right? Those are consumer goods, if you will, but those are definitely on that list. All right, good place to stop. All right, everybody, have a beautiful weekend.